I need to tell you something. Something that I have carried inside my chest, inside whatever passes for a chest on a being like me for 200 cycles. 200 years by the reckoning of the humans I'm going to tell you about. And I have not spoken of it. Not to my commander, not to my bond partner, not to the council tribunal that questioned me afterward. I gave them the official report, 11 pages of careful, measured language. Numbers, distances, casualty estimates, tactical assessments. I left out the part that actually mattered. I left out what it felt like to stand beside them. I left out the moment I understood, truly understood, in the marrow of my being, why there are gods in this galaxy who whisper the word human the way frightened children whisper the names of things that live in the dark. I'm telling it now because I'm old, because the archive seal has expired, because I think the galaxy deserves to know, and honestly, because I can still feel it, even after 200 cycles, even after everything I've seen since. I close my secondary eyes sometimes in the quiet hours before sleep, and I'm back there, at Harkin's breach, in the smoke and the fire and the impossible noise, standing next to a human named Marcus Rain who was bleeding from 3 separate wounds and grinning. Grinning, like it was the best day of his life. Let me start from the beginning. Chapter 2, Set Up the World Before. Harkin's breach is not a place you choose to visit. It is a place that chooses you, usually at the worst possible moment, usually when you have done something to deserve the attention of fate. It sits in the outer rim of the Kalthara system, 3 jump points from anything resembling civilization, 2 jump points from anything resembling comfort, and roughly 4 jump points from safety in any direction you might care to choose. The planet itself, designated KL7 on ASEAN charts, but the humans called it Harkin's Breach because that was the name of the general who first mapped it, and also the name of the canyon that cuts the planet's western continent nearly in half, is not a pleasant world. The atmosphere is breathable for most carbon-based species, but just barely. The air tastes like iron and old lightning. The gravity runs about 12% heavier than galactic standard. The weather patterns are what you might charitably call aggressive. The storms roll in off the equatorial belt without warning, carrying winds that can strip the polymer coating off a patrol vehicle in under an hour. The terrain in the Breach Canyon itself is something I still think about when I'm trying to describe the word hostile to young cadets. Basalt columns the color of dried blood, gorges so deep that sensors lose resolution before they touch the bottom. The rock formations, geological features called harkspires by the first survey teams, rise from the canyon floor in clusters of 3 and 4, some of them 60 or 70 meters tall, sharp at the tips like teeth. When the wind moves through them at certain speeds, they make a sound. A low, resonant, almost harmonic sound. Like something enormous breathing. I remember the first time I heard it, I'd only been on planet for 6 standard hours, still calibrating my environmental suit to the gravity differential, still adjusting to the iron taste of the air, and I thought, something is alive in those rocks. Some enormous, patient, primordial thing. That was the harkspire sound. Nothing alive, just geology. Just wind and ancient stone, and the acoustics of a world that had been formed in violence and never entirely calmed down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you why we were there. The short version is this. The Kalthara system had been contested territory for about 30 cycles. The ASEAN Dominion held it on paper. We had the original survey rights, the mineral extraction agreements, the formal documentation. The Veth Collective disagreed. The Veth Collective, for those who have managed to avoid encountering them, are a species of extraordinarily aggressive collective consciousness beings who have a cultural philosophy that translates roughly as: possession is the only law, and the only proof of possession is combat superiority. They had moved into the outer system about 30 cycles back, established mining operations in the asteroid belt, and then began a slow, grinding expansion inward. Not fast enough to trigger a formal war declaration, but persistent enough to make life extremely difficult for anyone trying to operate legitimately in the system. The ASEAN High Council had tried 3 rounds of formal negotiation. The VETH had accepted the negotiators, fed them well, listened politely, and then resumed their expansion approximately 9 hours after each negotiating team departed. This was the VETH way of conducting diplomacy. My role in all of this was as a senior intelligence observer. I was embedded with a small joint operations team, a coalition put together in something of a hurry by the 3 species who had the most to lose if the VETH took full control of the Kalthara system: the ASEANs, the Prohari, and the humans. The humans were the newest members of this particular coalition. They had only been formally admitted to the galactic community 31 cycles before the events I'm describing, which, by galactic standards, makes them practically infants. Barely old enough to be trusted with a jump-capable vessel, let alone a seat at a diplomatic table. The ASEAN contingent thought having humans involved was a bad idea. Not because we doubted their fighting capacity, we'd seen their combat data, reviewed their history. We had concerns about their reliability, their decision-making under pressure, their psychological stability in extreme situations. We thought they might break. I know how that sounds now. Bear with me. The team was 12 members total, 3 ASEANs including myself, 2 Prohari, a bonded pair named Thessaly and Vorn who served as our forward scouts, 4 humans, and 3 Marathi, who were our technical specialists and our primary reason for being on KL7 at all. They were there to access and extract a data repository in a decommissioned ASEAN monitoring station in the canyon, a repository that contained 30 cycles of VETH movement intelligence that would be extraordinarily valuable if we could retrieve it before the VETH realized what we were doing. In and out, clean extraction, 3 days on planet. That was the plan. The humans assigned to us were Marcus Rain, who served as the team's primary combat specialist and its de facto field commander, though he would have laughed at that title; Captain Yale Ben David, who was the mission's official human liaison and also one of the most composed people I have ever shared an operational space with; Private First Class Deo Akafer, 23 years old by human reckoning, on his first deployment off Earth, who carried a battered photograph in the front pocket of his tactical vest, and who sang very quietly to himself when he thought no one could hear; and Sergeant First Class Rin Nakashima, who spoke less than anyone else on the team, ate twice as much as anyone else on the team, and had a habit of falling asleep in the most improbable locations, and waking up the instant anything changed in the ambient sound environment around her. I am going to tell you about all of them. I am going to tell you everything I remember. Because the thing about humans, the thing you have to understand what happened at Harkin's breach, is that you can't separate them out. You can't say the soldier or the warrior as though they are one thing, one function, one predictable set of behaviors. They are individuals who are also simultaneously something collective, something that activates under pressure, something that shifts and changes and intensifies when things go wrong. I did not understand this when we touched down on KL7. I would understand it completely by the time we left. Chapter 3: The First Hours. We made our landing on the northern rim of the Breach Canyon, 3 kilometers from the old monitoring station. Standard insertion, quiet, low night cycle, the team working in near silence as we established our perimeter and checked equipment. The Hawksbears rose around us in the dark, their tips catching the faint light of KL7's 3 moons. The wind was low that first night, barely moving, and the sound the stones made was almost nothing, just a suggestion, a whisper. I remember standing at the canyon rim while the team set up the camp shelter, and looking down into the dark below, and feeling something unusual. Not fear. ASEANs don't experience fear in the way most other species do. We have a functional analog, an elevated state of alert readiness. But it doesn't carry the visceral quality that, say, human fear carries. What I felt was something closer to respect, for the place itself, for its indifference to us. Marcus Rain appeared beside me. He was the kind of person who moved quietly when he chose to, and loudly when he chose to, and the difference between the two modes was always deliberate. He stood at the rim for a moment without speaking, looking down into the same dark I was looking at. Then he said, "Hell of a place." I said, "It is not optimal." He laughed. It was a short, genuine sound. That's one way to put it. I had been briefed on human humor. I had read several papers on the subject. I knew, in theory, that humans used humor as a social bonding mechanism, and also as a coping mechanism for stress and anxiety. Understanding this in theory and experiencing it in practice are, I can tell you, very different things. Marcus pointed down into the canyon with one finger. "Stations down there. 3 kilometers horizontal, approximately half a kilometer of descent." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Marathi going to be okay with that descent? They're not great on uneven terrain, right?" He had done his research. Most species assigned to joint operations couldn't tell you basic physiological facts about their teammates. Marcus had clearly studied. I told him the Marathi had been issued enhanced mobility gear for the terrain. He nodded, looked at the canyon for another moment. Then he said, "Velkarath." I told him my name early in the mission briefing, partly as a diplomatic gesture, and partly because I'd found in prior joint operations that having team members use my actual designation rather than my observer number improved communication quality. He'd used it correctly from the first hour, which surprised me. I said, "Yes." "You think the Veth know we're here yet?" I gave him the honest answer, "Likely not yet, probably within 6 to 12 hours. He took that in. Most beings, when given that information, the enemy will know your position within 12 hours, show some version of anxiety, a physical response, a change in breathing or posture. Marcus just nodded slowly, like I'd told him the weather forecast. "Then we should get some sleep," he said. 6 hours, start moving before dawn." And that was it. He walked back to camp, told the team 6 hours, and the humans organized their rest rotation with a kind of quiet efficiency that I found, at the time, slightly unsettling. They weren't afraid. Or if they were, and I think now they probably were, or something close to it, they didn't show it in any way I had been trained to read. I sat at the canyon rim for another hour, running my preliminary scans. Somewhere in the dark below, the Harkspires breathed. Chapter 4, The Descent. We moved at what the humans called 0400, before the first of KL7's moons had fully set, while the light was still the color of old pewter, and the temperature had dropped enough that the iron taste in the air sharpened to something almost metallic. The descent into the breach was, to put it plainly, difficult. The route we had mapped took us down a series of natural ledges, geological step-downs in the basalt that created something almost like a staircase, if stairs were made for beings with 4 legs and an average height of approximately 3 meters. For bipedal beings of roughly human scale, it was manageable but slow. For the Marathi, who stand about 1.1 meters tall and move on 6 limbs, the enhanced mobility gear compensated reasonably well, but they still moved more slowly than the rest of us. I watched the humans adapt to the terrain in real time. This is something I want to describe carefully because it is hard to convey if you haven't seen it. Humans are not the strongest species in the galactic community. They are not the fastest. Their sensory apparatus is mediocre at best, poor low-light vision, limited hearing range, no electromagnetic sensitivity to speak of. By almost any objective biological metric, they are mid-tier, nothing exceptional. But they have this quality when terrain is difficult. They adapt, Not in a calculated way, not in a way that looks like problem solving. It looks more like water finding its way downhill. They try something. If it doesn't work, they try something slightly different. If that doesn't work, they try something else. And they do all of this so quickly and with so little apparent distress that it barely registers as problem solving at all. It looks like intuition. It looks almost like the terrain is part of them. Deo was the youngest, but he moved like he'd been climbing canyon walls his whole life, finding handholds I would not have noticed, testing weight before committing, moving with a fluid economy that looked almost choreographed. Rin descended in a different way entirely, systematic, methodical, each movement deliberate and assessed before execution, and was about 30% slower than Deo, but never once had to backtrack or correct a bad step. Yale moved in yet a third way, flowing, almost relaxed, chatting in low murmurs with the Prohari scouts as she descended as though she were on a leisure excursion. And Marcus moved like someone who had been in bad terrain many times and had made peace with it. Not graceful exactly, he was a large man, broad-shouldered, about 1.9 meters tall, and graceful was not quite the right word. He moved with intention, every step placed like it meant something. It took us 4 hours to reach the canyon floor. By the time we arrived, the first moon had set and the second was rising, and the light in the canyon was a strange blue-gray that made everything look slightly unreal. The Harkspire clusters were denser down here, dozens of them, rising from the canyon floor in tight formations, their tips maybe 30 meters overhead. The breathing sound was louder at the bottom, not overwhelming, but constant, a presence. Vorn, the male of the Prohari pair, said something to his bond partner in their own tongue that I didn't catch. I asked Yale, who had some Prohari, what he'd said. She smiled. He said the stones sing like the dead trying to remember something. I thought that was one of the more unsettling things I'd heard in a while. Then the monitor station came into view around a curve in the canyon wall, and we stopped talking about the stones. Chapter 5: The Station. The old monitoring station was a squat, hexagonal structure set back against the canyon wall, partially obscured by a natural overhang of basalt. It had been decommissioned approximately 15 cycles ago, power rerouted, personnel withdrawn, sealed according to standard ASEAN protocol. From the outside it looked dead, dark. The exterior panels were coated in the dust and mineral deposits of 15 years of weather. But it was intact, that mattered, the Veth had not found it. Yeva, the senior Marathi technician, began her access work, while the rest of us maintained perimeter. This was a straightforward process by design. The Marathi had been given the access credentials for the station's legacy systems before departure. Extract the data repository, copy it to encrypted portable storage, seal the station again. 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. It took 11 minutes before the first problem appeared. Yeva came out of the station's access port with a look I had learned to read as Marathi consternation, a slight widening of the lower eye cluster, a drawing in of the gill fins. She spoke to me directly. "The repository is intact," she said, "but the extraction interface is not the legacy system. Someone has updated the access architecture." I absorbed this. Updated when? Approximately 4 cycles ago, based on the modification timestamps. 4 cycles ago was well inside the Veth's presence in the system, which meant either the Veth had accessed this station and didn't realize what they had possible, but unlikely, or someone else had been here and updated the system for reasons we didn't currently understand. Neither possibility was comfortable. I relayed this to Marcus, who was watching the northern approaches from a position behind a Harkspire cluster. He came over, listened, asked 2 questions. Can Yeva still extract the data, and how long will it take? And when I gave him the answers, yes. But the process is now significantly more complex. Estimate 4 to 6 hours. He didn't swear, didn't argue, Didn't do any of the things I'd observed beings do when plans change unexpectedly. He said, okay, we set up a proper perimeter, we give her the time. And then he did something that I want to be careful to describe accurately, because it seems small, but it was not small. He looked at Yeva directly, not at me, not at the station, at Yeva specifically, and he said, "You've got everything you need. We'll keep you clear." Yeva's gill fins did something, a small movement. If you know Marathi physiology, you'd recognize it as the equivalent of something between relief and gratitude. She said, "Yes, thank you, Marcus." He nodded once and went back to his position. I watched this exchange and thought about it for a long time afterward. It seemed like nothing. It was not nothing. In that moment, with the operation suddenly extended to 4 to 6 times its intended duration, in a location that was going to become known to the Veth within hours, in that moment, Marcus Rain's one priority was making sure the one person who could complete the mission felt supported, felt that she was covered, felt that she could work. I had been in joint operations with 15 different species over 40 cycles. I had never seen that done so cleanly. Chapter 6: The Waiting. The hours between the station and the attack are not dramatic to describe, but I want to describe them anyway, because they are part of the truth of what happened. We waited, we held perimeter. The wind picked up as KL7's day cycle began. The sun here is a pale, greenish-yellow thing, not warm in any way you'd recognize, but it drives the weather, and the harkspires began their sound in earnest, loud enough now to feel in your chest. The breathing of the stones, amplified, constant. Deo sang. Very quietly. I wouldn't have caught it with Ossian hearing if I'd been further away. He was positioned at the southeastern edge of our perimeter, behind a cluster of low basalt outcroppings, watching an approach channel with his weapon held across his knees. And he sang in a language I didn't recognize, not English, which was his primary operational language, but something else. Something older, I thought, something from home. I asked him about it later, in the quiet before the Veth arrived. He looked surprised that I'd heard. Then he smiled, a young person's smile, not guarded at all, completely genuine, and he said, "It's Yoruba. My grandmother taught me. She said if you keep singing, even the bad places can't entirely swallow you." I filed this in my memory under the heading of things I do not fully understand, but suspect are important. Rin slept for 90 minutes, just sat down against a harkspire with her weapon on her lap, closed her eyes, and was instantly, fully asleep. Then she was instantly, fully awake again, as though someone had flipped a switch, and she resumed her observation post without a word. Yale wrote. Not a report. I could see the format from my angle. It was a letter, written on a physical paper notebook she carried in her chest pocket. She wrote in the intervals between perimeter checks, compact, neat script, filling maybe 2 pages over 4 hours. She folded it carefully and put it back in the notebook and said nothing about it. I understood, I think, what that letter was. I understood for whom it was written. I chose not to think about it. Marcus moved the whole time, not restlessly, not with nervous energy, but with the deliberate, quiet movement of someone conducting a continuous assessment of their environment. He'd check one approach channel, then move to another, then come back. He'd crouch and look at the canyon floor and then look up at the canyon rim above. He'd stand very still for a few minutes and just listen. After the second hour he came to me and said, "Northern rim, half a kilometer up canyon, you see that?" I pulled my environmental scanner to the location he indicated. I saw it. 4 Veth Scout units on the canyon rim, stationary, looking down. My internal readiness systems elevated significantly. "They're scanning," I said. "Passive sensors at this point. They may not have resolved our position yet." "How long until they decide to come down?" "If they identify heat signatures, 20 minutes, possibly less." Marcus was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted them. Then he said, "Tell me the best defensible position in this canyon, not for survival, for buying Yeva time." I ran the assessment, gave him 3 locations. He chose the middle one, a natural choke point where the canyon narrowed between 2 Harkspire clusters about 80 meters north of the station. It had limited cover but excellent line of sight on both approach vectors. "Can 3 of us hold it long enough?" he asked. "Hold it entirely, against a Veth advance unit. No, delay it significantly. Yes, possibly long enough." He went and spoke to Yale and Rin. I didn't hear all of it, but I heard the shape of it. Calm, direct. "These are the facts. This is what I'm asking for. You decide." Both of them agreed. He came back and said, "Deo stays with the Marathi and the Prilhari. Better to have 4 at the station than 3. I said, "What about me?" He looked at me, really looked at me the way humans look at things when they're deciding something. "Can you fight?" "I am rated for field combat operations." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "Yes," I said, "I can fight." "Then you come with us." I want to pause here, mid-testimony, mid-memory, and tell you something about the Veth Collective, because if you don't understand what we were facing, you can't understand what happened next. The Veth are not, by galactic standards, an unusually powerful species. They don't have exceptional technology. Their individual physical capability is above galactic average, but not dramatically so. What makes them effective? What has made them effective for 4 centuries of aggressive territorial expansion is their collective consciousness. The collective links every Veth unit in a combat theater to every other Veth unit. There is no lag. There is no miscommunication. There is no individual who hesitates while waiting for orders, because there are no individuals in the functional sense. There is only the collective, moving and thinking and adapting as a single organism. This makes them extraordinarily difficult to surprise. It makes coordinating against them exceptionally challenging, because any tactic that works against one element of their force is immediately known to every other element. The ASEAN High Command had designated the Veth as a Tier 4 threat, the same tier as the Greenock Hegemony and the Shard Collective, the kind of species that well-equipped military forces plan for carefully and engage with caution. We had 4 humans, 3 ASEANs, 2 Prilhari, and 3 Marathi, and 83 Veth descending into the canyon. I ran the numbers. I did not share the numbers. Chapter 8, The Choke Point. The position Marcus had chosen was good, better than I'd assessed initially. When I got there and looked at it with fresh eyes, I could see that he'd identified something I had not. The way the 2 Harkspire clusters angled toward each other on either side of the canyon narrowing created not just a line-of-sight advantage but a deflection geometry. Weapons fire directed at our position from anything north of the choke point would hit at an angle, striking the basalt spires and losing significant energy before reaching us. Not a shield, but an advantage. He'd seen that in 60 seconds of looking. I filed this under things I do not fully understand, but suspect are important. The 4 of us, Marcus, Yale, Rin, and myself, set up in the choke point. We had perhaps 12 minutes before the Veth began their descent, maybe 8 before they had us on sensor. In those minutes, the 3 humans did something that I have replayed in my memory many times since. They talked. Not about tactics, not about the Veth, not about the mission or the odds or the things that were likely to happen in the next hour. Marcus said, "Yale, what's the thing you're going to eat first when you get home?" Yale, who was running a final check on her weapons system, said without looking up, "My mother's fish. She makes this, it's a Moroccan dish, chermoula sauce, fresh fish, herbs from her garden. She's been growing those herbs for 30 years. Yeah, a pause. That sounds incredible. What about you? Pizza, Marcus said immediately. The specific pizza from this specific place in Chicago that my sister introduced me to when I was 18 years old, and that I have been thinking about at approximately 15-second intervals ever since. Rin, from her position, said, "Tonkatsu ramen, my aunt's, non-negotiable." "A beat." Marcus said, "Velkarath, what about you?" I was startled. I processed the question. I said, "I don't. Asians don't have the same relationship to food that." "Okay, but if you did," Marcus said. I thought about it. There is a kind of a mineral suspension from a spring on Asha Prime. When I was training, I would think about it sometimes when the training was difficult. "Then that's what you're having when we get home," Marcus said. He said it simply, firmly, like it was decided. "Deal." I said deal. And I meant it as a social response, a politeness. But something happened in my chest when I said it. Something changed. The food was not the point. The food had never been the point. The point was when we get home, said as a certainty, said as a simple statement of what would happen, not if, not hopefully, when. I don't know if Marcus did that deliberately. I suspect he did. I suspect he understood something about the psychological mechanics of when versus if that his species had learned through long and painful experience with its own fear. 8 minutes later, the first Veth came around the north bend of the canyon. Chapter 9, First Contact. The Veth don't announce themselves. There's no warning communication, no demand to stand down, no attempt at negotiation. That's not collective philosophy. They arrive and they take. That's the entirety of their approach to contested situations. The first unit came around the canyon bend at a pace that I can only describe as purposeful, not rushed. The collective doesn't rush. Rushing implies urgency, implies individual anxiety, and the collective has no individuals and no anxiety. It simply moves at the speed that is optimal for the objective. There were 9 of them in the lead element. Veth are roughly bipedal, 2 primary locomotion limbs, 2 primary manipulation limbs, an additional dorsal stabilization appendage that they extend in combat situations for balance. Their exoskeletal armor is organically grown, a hardened version of their own biological carapace, and it's the color of tarnished copper, brownish gold, iridescent in certain lights, catching the greenish-yellow sun of KL7 in a way that made them look, in that moment, almost beautiful. Almost. They saw us at 40 meters. I know they saw us because the lead unit stopped moving, all 9 of them, simultaneously, without any visible signal, just stopped. This is collective coordination, instantaneous. And then something I had read about in the tactical briefings, but never experienced firsthand. The sound the Veth make when the collective has identified a threat. It's not a war cry. It's not a communication. It's the sound of a collective consciousness achieving full combat focus, a layered, harmonic, atonal sound that rises from multiple units simultaneously, not planned, not coordinated, just the natural expression of a linked mind transitioning to full combat mode. The Harkspires around us were already making their breathing sound. The Veth sound layered over it. For approximately 1 second, it was genuinely one of the most frightening sounds I have ever heard. Marcus fired first. Clean, precise, 1 shot, and this is important, not at the lead unit, not at the easiest target. He had identified the unit at the right edge of the Veth formation that was moving into the best flanking angle. That unit was not obviously the greatest threat. But Marcus had looked at the geometry of the approaching collective and identified the element that would make everything else worse if it wasn't removed from the equation. 1 shot. The unit went down. The collective adjusted. It always adjusts. That's the fundamental challenge of facing the Veth. Whatever works once, works exactly once. They don't make the same mistake twice because there's no individual who made a mistake to begin with. The whole collective learns simultaneously. Within 4 seconds of Marcus's shot, the remaining 8 units in the lead element had shifted formation. no longer a linear advance, now spreading wide, using the Harkspires as cover, approaching on 3 separate lines simultaneously. Rin engaged the left flank. Yale took the right. Marcus moved to the center, and something changed in the way he moved. I can't entirely describe it. It was as though the part of him that was casual, that was eating pizza and talking about what he'd have when we got home, that part had stepped back and something else had stepped forward. Not a different personality, more like a deeper layer. Something underneath the casual that was calm in a completely different way. Operational calm. The calm of someone who has prepared for this specific moment for so long that the moment itself feels familiar. He moved between cover positions with a fluidity that didn't match his size. He communicated with Yale and Rin in fragments, single words, sometimes just sounds, and they responded without apparent confusion. They were not thinking. They were not planning. They were operating in a state that I recognized from the tactical literature but had never seen in practice. The cognitive mode that high-skill humans enter under high-stress combat conditions, where conscious deliberation steps aside, and what remains is pattern recognition and trained response, fast and precise and consuming almost none of the mental bandwidth that deliberate thought would require. The Veth came at us, and we held the choke point. Here is the thing about the Veth Collective that every military briefing will tell you. They are relentless. This is not a tactical choice. It is not a cultural value. It is simply what they are. The collective is incapable of retreat in the way that individual species retreat. Retreat requires an individual to override their survival instinct or their commitment to the group. The collective has no survival instinct in the individual sense and no group instinct in the individual sense. It has only the objective, and it moves toward the objective until it achieves the objective, or until it is incapable of movement. What the briefings don't tell you, what I learned at Harkin's Breach, is that this quality, when it meets a certain quality in humans, creates something extraordinary. Because humans also do not retreat from the things they have decided to hold. Not when it costs them, not when it seems unwise, not when the math says clearly that holding is not possible. They hold anyway. This is not the same as the Veth's relentlessness. The Veth don't have a choice. The humans chose. Marcus took a grazing energy strike to his left shoulder in the 7th minute of the engagement. The Veth energy weapons burn on contact, not catastrophic at a grazing angle, but painful in a way I could see in his face. Not in distress exactly, more like acknowledgement. This has happened. He checked the arm for functionality, found it intact, kept shooting. Yale took a strike to her lower leg at minute 11. She went down to one knee, assessed, continued firing from the lower position. At minute 13 she stood up again, putting weight on it, and I genuinely don't know how that was possible, but she did it. Rin was not hit at all in the first 15 minutes, and I later realized this was not luck. She had a spatial awareness that I can only describe as eerie. She seemed to know where Veth fire was going to arrive before it arrived, and she was not where it was going to arrive. I watched her move, and it looked almost like she was avoiding something I couldn't see. The Veth sent a second element around the East Canyon wall, a flanking move that the collective had calculated would force us to split our attention. It was the correct tactical decision. It should have worked. Marcus saw it coming before it arrived. I don't know how. I was running sensor sweeps. He shouldn't have had the sensor data before I processed it. But he turned toward the East Canyon wall 45 seconds before the second element appeared and said to Rin, "East wall coming high." She turned to cover it. When the second element emerged, they ran into Rin. I want to tell you about the next part carefully, because I think it gets to the heart of something. The second Veth element was 6 units. They came down the east wall on repelling lines. A rapid descent meant to bring them into our rear position fast enough that we couldn't adjust. Standard collective deployment for a flanking move against a fixed position. They should have had the element of surprise. They did not have the element of surprise. Rin was waiting. She took the first 2 units as they came off the wall, clean, rapid, no hesitation. Then she moved toward the second repelling line, rather than away from it, which I recognized from the tactical literature as a genuinely counterintuitive choice. Moving toward the threat closed the distance, which most beings' instincts reject. She closed the distance, and the remaining 4 units couldn't bring their weapons to bear at the angle she'd taken without risking hitting each other. She exploited the geometry for 11 seconds before Marcus disengaged from the central exchange long enough to cover her, at which point she stepped back, and the remaining units found themselves in a crossfire they had not planned for. The collective adapts, but you have to survive long enough for the adaptation to matter. The collective lost the second element entirely. It regrouped and sent a third. There was a moment, somewhere in the 20th or 23rd minute of the engagement, I have lost precise track, when the Veth collective tried something I had not seen documented in any tactical literature. It stopped advancing. All remaining Veth units in the canyon simultaneously stopped moving. The silence that followed was extraordinary. After 20+ minutes of continuous energy weapon fire, continuous movement, continuous collective sound, silence, the Harkspires breathed. Nothing else moved. I did not know what this meant. I ran assessments. I checked for indicators of withdrawal, of regrouping, of a new flanking element I hadn't detected. Marcus said very quietly, "They're thinking." I looked at him. The collective doesn't think in the individual. "I know what the briefings say," he said, quiet, focused. "They're thinking. Something we did gave them a problem they haven't solved yet." He was right. I confirmed it 13 seconds later when my sensors detected communication bursts between the Veth units in the canyon and something above the rim, a higher-level element of the collective, I believe, being consulted. A tactical reconsideration. We had given the Veth collective a problem it needed to escalate to a higher level of its own consciousness. 3 humans and 1 Osean observer. In 23 minutes. I sat with this for a moment in the middle of the engagement, in the strange quiet of the collective thinking, and I felt something that is difficult to describe. Not pride, not in myself. I had contributed, but I was not the story. Something more like awe. The word doesn't quite translate from Osean, but the closest approximation is a concept that means witnessing something that changes what you thought was possible. Marcus was watching the canyon north of us. He turned and looked at me. "Velkarath, how long does Yeva need?" I checked my comm link. 20 to 35 minutes. She's hit another complication in the interface architecture. He absorbed this. I watched him absorb it, watched the math happen in his face, the calculation of what 20 to 35 more minutes meant given what we were currently facing. He said, "We can do that." Not "I think we can." Not "we'll try." He said we can do that with the same tone he'd used to say when we get home. Yale heard it from her position. I saw something in her face, a kind of answering steadiness, like his certainty had called something up in her. Rin said nothing, but she shifted her position slightly, settling more comfortably into her cover, the way a person settles in when they're prepared to be somewhere for a while. The Veth came again. Chapter 12, The Price. I am not going to pretend the rest of it was clean. It was not clean. The collective's third advance came with greater force and a different configuration. It had used the pause to solve the flanking geometry problem, and the new approach brought units from 3 directions nearly simultaneously, including a vertical element that came over the canyon rim above us and descended on lines. Marcus was hit again, twice left thigh right side. He went down to one knee, kept firing from there, and said with a completely level voice, "Rin, left side." She was already moving. Yale took a direct hit, not grazing this time, to her left shoulder, full energy strike, and I heard the sound she made. not a scream. Something more like a sharp, compressed exhale, a sound of someone doing the calculation of what just happened and choosing to push it to the side. She switched her weapon to her right hand and kept firing. I need to tell you something about pain. Ossians don't experience pain the way humans do. We have nociceptive response, injury signals, damage indicators, but they don't carry the emotional weight that human pain carries. I have studied human pain responses extensively in the literature. I understand, in theory, what those injuries would have felt like. Yale fired 17 accurate shots after taking that hit. I want you to understand what that means. She was in genuine, significant pain, the kind that humans describe in the literature as all-consuming, the kind that the nervous system usually responds to by narrowing the entire experiential focus down to the location of the damage. And she was in that state, and she was firing accurate shots. Not wild, accurate, targeting the VETH units on the right flank, maintaining her part of the coverage pattern, not breaking formation. I filed this under a new heading, things I will never fully understand but can never forget. The vertical element coming over the rim was the critical threat. 6 units, repelling simultaneously, configured to land in a spread pattern that would force us to divide our fire in too many directions at once. Marcus saw it. He didn't have an angle from his current position. He was down on one knee. The canyon wall above him was blocking his shot. He needed to move to a position that exposed him. He moved. He came out from cover and took 2 more steps into open ground to get the angle on the descending units, and he was in the open, fully visible to the remaining VETH units in the northern canyon approach, and he fired up at the repelling elements. And the VETH in the north fired at him. I ran the numbers in real time. He was exposed. The angle was wrong. The collective had 4 units with clear lines of fire on him, and he was in the open. Yale shifted. From her position, injured shoulder, weapon in her right hand, she shifted her angle of fire to cover Marcus's exposed side. Not all of it. She couldn't cover all of it, but she covered the 2 units with the best shots. Marcus fired, hit 3 of the 6 descending units before they reached the canyon floor. The other 3 landed. What happened in the next 40 seconds is difficult to describe in a way that fully captures it, because I was not focused on one person. I was trying to track the whole situation, and it was very fast and very loud, and the harkspares were doing their full sound in the background, and the light in the canyon was now midday green-yellow, and the reflections off the copper VETH carapaces were everywhere. But here is what I can tell you. The 3 VETH units that landed were inside our position, inside the choke point, too close for the kind of fire we'd been using. This is when the engagement became different. And this is when I learned the final thing about humans. The thing I'd read about but had not understood. I had read in the briefings that humans, when pressed into close-quarters combat, when the distance closes and the situation becomes immediate and physical, undergo a psychological state shift that is distinct from their general combat mode. The literature called it several things. The clinical term was acute stress response with disinhibited motor facilitation. Other papers called it combat intensity trance. One paper I remembered from training, a Prilhari psychological study, called it, bluntly, the state in which humans become something other than what they were. I understood what those papers were describing now. Marcus came off the ground. He had been shot 4 times. He came off the ground. He was not grinning. That came later. In that moment he had no expression at all, a focused blankness that was more unsettling than rage would have been, because rage is something recognizable, something you can categorize. This was not rage. This was the absence of every non-essential thing. No anger, no fear, no hesitation, no doubt. Just a human being in the fullest possible engagement with the present moment. He closed distance with the nearest VETH unit, and the engagement was not clean, and I am not going to describe it in detail because this testimony is already difficult to write. I will say, the Veth unit was no longer a threat after approximately 8 seconds. Rin handled the second unit. Yale handled the third. Injured arm, injured leg, she handled the third. The collective withdrew at minute 37. Not a full retreat, a tactical disengagement. The remaining units in the canyon pulled back north of the bend, out of direct engagement range. The communication bursts between the canyon units and the rim-level collective elevated significantly in intensity. I was getting fragments of it on my scanner, and while I don't have complete Veth linguistic data, the pattern suggested the kind of communication that happens when a collective is recalibrating a fundamental tactical assumption. We held the choke point. Yeva's voice came over the comm link. Extraction complete, 30 seconds to seal. I said this out loud, and I will tell you what happened. Marcus laughed. He was bleeding from his shoulder, his thigh, his side. He was in a position that any clinical assessment would describe as requiring immediate medical attention. He was sitting against a basalt spire at the edge of our position, one hand pressed to his side, and he laughed. It was not a forced sound. It was a genuine, full, slightly incredulous sound of someone who has made it to the other side of something that could very reasonably have gone the other way. Yale, from her position, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. Rin said, "About time." And then Deo's voice came over the comm from the station position. "We're sealed, ready to move." A pause. "Is everyone?" Another pause where I could hear him reading the comm data on casualties and hits. "Holy, is everyone okay?" "We're good, Deo," Marcus said. His voice was steady and warm and completely at odds with his physical state. "Marcus, your biometrics are." "We're good," Marcus said again. A long silence from Deo. Then quietly, "Okay, we're ready." Chapter 14, The Ascent. Getting back up the canyon was harder than the descent, for obvious reasons. Yale needed support for most of the climb. Her left arm was non-functional, and her leg was badly burned, though the suit's emergency sealing had slowed the damage. Marcus could walk but not well, and he refused any support for the first half of the ascent until Deo, with great diplomatic care, stopped arguing and just walked beside him in a way that was technically not support, but practically was whenever the terrain required it. Rin moved with her normal methodical precision, apparently entirely fine, and I noticed several of the Marathi watching her with what I recognized as a kind of hushed attention. I carried Yale's pack. It was the most useful thing I could do. The Veth did not pursue. I have thought about this a great deal in the 2 centuries since. The collective could have. It had numbers. It could have caught us on the ascent, which was slower and more exposed than our descent had been. The math favored pursuit. It chose not to pursue. I believe, and I have believed this for 200 cycles, and nothing I have subsequently learned has changed my view, that the collective was recalculating, not just tactically, fundamentally. It had done the math on Harkin's breach, and the math had come out wrong, and the collective was doing what collective intelligences do when they encounter data that doesn't fit their model. It was revising the model. 3 humans had held a choke point against 83 Veth for 37 minutes. 4 times wounded, still fighting, still accurate, still adapting. The collective had never encountered this specific thing before. It needed time to understand what it had encountered. It would not have time. We got out. When we crested the canyon rim, the second of KL7's moons was rising, and the sky had turned the color of old copper, a deep, burnished orange red that turned the Harkspire tips below us into something almost golden. The team moved to the extraction LZ, and the Marathi transmitted the extraction signal, and we stood on the rim with the wind moving around us, and the stone-breathing sound of the Harkspires rising up from below. Deo sat down on a flat rock and put his face in his hands for about 30 seconds. Then he looked up and he was composed, not perfectly. His eyes were wet, but composed. Marcus sat next to him. He didn't say anything, he just sat next to him. I stood a few feet away and looked at the canyon below and thought about everything I'd seen in the last 7 hours, and I tried to find the right category for it, the right conceptual frame, the right way to understand what I had witnessed. I didn't have one. The extraction ship came in from the south, small, fast, running dark, exactly on the coordinates Marathi-Yeva had broadcast. The pilot, an Ossian named Sarath, opened the hatch and then stopped when he saw the state of the team. Stopped and looked at Marcus, at Yale, at the blood and the burns and the way they were moving, and I watched him do what Ossians sometimes do when we see something that exceeds our prepared understanding of a situation. He went very still and very quiet. Marcus walked past him into the ship, held the interior rail for a moment to steady himself, and then turned back and said, "Nice ship. Does it have a food replicator?" Sarath said blankly, "Yes." "Good," Marcus said. "Rin wants ramen and I want pizza, and we're going to need the machine to be creative." Sarath looked at me. I said in Ossian, "I will explain later. Can we depart?" We departed. In the ship before the jump, while the medical unit was working on Yale and Marcus, and Rin sat nearby watching them the way a person sits with people they care about, I wrote the first notes for this testimony. The raw version. The notes I would later turn into 11 pages of carefully measured, useful, operational intelligence that told the High Council what had happened at Harkin's breach. The notes I wrote on the ship were different. I wrote they chose, they always choose. This is the thing I did not understand and now I do. The collective is incapable of choice. It is incapable of fear. It is incapable of deciding to do the impossible thing. It is, in some sense, incapable of anything except what it has already decided. But humans choose in the moment. They assess the impossible and they choose it. Not because they don't understand that it's impossible, because they've decided that impossible doesn't outrank necessary. I wrote, the things the briefing said about human instability, human unreliability, human psychological fragility under pressure. I don't know what humans those briefings were describing. I would like to meet those humans, because they were not the ones at Harkin's breach. I wrote, when Marcus laughed after it was over, bleeding in pain, sitting against basalt, when he laughed, it was the laugh of someone who has looked at what nearly killed them and found something in it. Not amusement, something older than amusement, some quality that I don't have a word for in Ossian. The closest translation I can find is a concept from the human culture of my teammate Deo. His grandmother's word for the feeling of keeping singing in the bad places, so the bad places cannot swallow you. I wrote finally, I understand now. I understand why gods fear them, not because humans are invincible. They are not invincible, not because they cannot be hurt. They can be hurt terribly. The gods fear them because humans keep choosing. In the face of everything that says stop, they choose. In the face of everything that says it cannot be done, they do it. Not all of them, not always. But when it matters most, when the thing they are protecting requires it, they become something that the math cannot account for. And nothing in this galaxy that builds its power on the certainty of mathematics can easily make peace with that. Chapter 17, Afterward. I want to tell you what happened after. The data Yeva extracted from the monitoring station was exactly what it was supposed to be, 30 cycles of Veth movement intelligence that, when properly analyzed, gave the joint forces of the Ashan-Prohari human coalition a clear picture of the Veth expansion strategy in the Kalthara system. The High Council used it. The broader coalition used it. Within 6 cycles, a coordinated defensive posture had been established that stopped the Veth expansion cold. Not a war, not a battle. The intelligence was enough. The 37 minutes at Harkin's breach made that possible. Marcus Rain spent 12 days in a human medical facility and then, as far as my records indicate, went back to work. I found this astonishing. I still find it astonishing. Yale's shoulder required reconstructive surgery. The energy strike had damaged structural elements that required significant repair, and she was on medical leave for 3 months. I know because she wrote me a letter. An actual letter, physical format, delivered through the ASEAN Intelligence Liaison System. I still have it. The letter talked about her mother's fish, and about the herb garden, and about the fact that she had in fact eaten the fish during her recovery, and it had been as good as promised. She did not mention the engagement directly. She didn't need to. Rin wrote nothing, but through Deo, who wrote me once, a long, rambling communication full of descriptions of his family and his neighborhood and several paragraphs about his grandmother's cooking. I learned that Rin was fine, working, occasionally visited the others. Deo himself. I kept his letter for a long time. I still have it somewhere in my archive. He talked about everything except the breach, and in doing so, by the shape of what was absent, told me everything about how it had settled in him. He ended with a line from something his grandmother had apparently said, which Deo had translated for me. If you come back singing, the bad place didn't win. I came back singing, in my way. I had not expected to. 200 cycles later, I have been asked many times, by students and cadets and colleagues, and once by a member of the ASEAN High Council herself, what the most important thing I learned at Harkin's breach was. I always tell them the same thing. The most important thing I learned was not tactical. It was not about the VETH. It was not about coalition operations or intelligence extraction or the mechanics of holding a choke point in a canyon on a hostile weather world. The most important thing I learned was about the difference between beings who function and beings who choose. Most of us ASEANs, Prilhari, Marathi, even the VETH in their collective way, function. We operate within the parameters of what our nature, our training, our situation allows. We do the possible thing. We make the rational calculation. We operate well within our defined capacities. Humans in the right moment choose. They choose to go beyond function. They choose to exceed what is possible. They do not do this because they are unaware of the limits. Marcus knew exactly what the math said about 37 minutes against 83 VETH. He knew it the moment I gave him the assessment. He chose anyway, not despite the math, not ignoring the math, after the math. After looking at the math clearly, and deciding that the math was not the final word. This is why gods fear them. Not every human does this. Most humans, most of the time, are just people, eating pizza and worrying about things and writing letters and singing quietly to themselves in bad places. They are not extraordinary in their ordinary moments. They are very ordinary in their ordinary moments. But when the moment comes, when the thing that matters most is under threat, something in them shifts. Something older than their civilization, older than their wars, older even than their language activates. The layer underneath the casual. The layer that has been there since the first human looked at something enormous and dangerous and decided to fight back anyway. I have never encountered another species that has that layer. I have never stopped being grateful that they do. I want to end this testimony with something that happened in the ship, before the jump, after I had written my first raw notes. I was sitting near the forward observation port. The ship was still in atmosphere, climbing toward the jump threshold, and below us the breach canyon was visible from altitude, the Harkspires tiny from up here, the whole thing just a scar in the surface of a difficult world. Marcus came and sat near me. His wounds were dressed, the medical unit had done what it could, and he moved carefully, but he moved. He looked out the observation port at the canyon below. After a while he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said I didn't. "Those stones," he said, "the sound they make, the breathing sound." I said yes. Geology right, just wind through rock. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The canyon was getting smaller below us as we climbed. Still sounds like something's alive down there, he said. Like something's been there a long time and it's still just breathing, still here. Whatever came and went, whatever happened, it's just still breathing. I thought about this. I think that's a reasonable description, I said. He nodded slowly, watching the canyon until it was too small to see anymore. Then he said, good. And that was it. Good, like it mattered to him. Like the idea of something old and patient surviving in that difficult place. Like the fact that something just kept breathing, no matter what, was a comfort to him. I think about that moment more than almost any other moment from that day, more than the combat, more than the numbers, more than the moment I understood why gods fear them. I think about Marcus watching the canyon and saying good because something down there was still breathing. Because I think that's the full answer to the question I've been trying to answer for 200 cycles. Why do gods fear humans? Because they're still here. Because they keep coming back. Because whatever happens to them, whatever it costs them, whatever the math says about their chances, they just keep breathing. Like the stones. Like something that has been there long enough to outlast everything else. Like something that has decided, in the quiet place underneath the casual and the fear and the math, that it is not done yet. Not done yet. The canyon breathes on. Somewhere in the Ossian archives, a letter from a soldier talks about her mother's herbs. Somewhere a young man is singing a word his grandmother taught him. And somewhere in the galactic record, sealed for 200 years, the truth, that 3 humans held a door against 83 of the universe's most relentless predators, and held it long enough for the thing worth protecting to survive. We all have fears. We all have things we can't account for in the math. The gods have humans. I finally understand why.